All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started. Tonight's class, which is on Samson Raphael Hirsch, has been sponsored by Carla and Jules Schulzbach in memory of Jules' great-grandfather, Professor Dr. Abram Schulzbach, who actually taught for many years in the Hirsch Real Schul in Frankfurt, which was the school founded by Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, who we will be learning about this evening. So a special treat that they have sponsored, and we have a second special treat, in that Dr. Kalman Stein has agreed to teach this class. Dr. Stein is the current head of school at Hebrew Academy. We only have a few more months left with you here, which we appreciate your taking some time to teach us this evening. And without any further ado, I turn the floor over. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Freundlich. When Rabbi Freundlich asked me to do this several months ago, I said yes for two reasons. First of all, because I'm very grateful to Rabbi Freundlich for all the things he's done and all the time he spent volunteering at Hebrew Academy over the last 2.5 years, but also because, and you know them better than I have a great sense of gratitude to the Wainberg family. Dr. Wainberg is a part of the Bracha, and Tibadei Alaka and his wife were gracious enough to give me their apartment when I came to Montreal 2.5 years ago, and living in that apartment has certainly enhanced my experience here. So I'm very grateful to the Wainberg family. When Rabbi Freundlich asked me which of the various figures on the list I would like to talk about, I chose Rav Hirsch for two reasons. First of all, because I felt that dealing with a gadol whose primary role was as a Talmudic scholar and a posek would be more appropriate for people like Rabbi Freundlich to deal with it for me. And also because my own academic background, my doctorate is in German history, and I spent 10 years of my life, figuratively, if not literally, in 19th century Germany. So the whole milieu of 19th century Germany is very familiar to me. My dissertation was on the working class in Lübeck, Germany in the 19th and early 20th century. If you don't want to read it, I'm going to make it into a musical comedy as soon as I've retired, and you can come and see it on Broadway. So Rav Hirsch. So you all know Rav Hirsch is known. Rav Hirsch was born in 1808, he died in 1888. He is known as the founder of what has been called Neo-Orthodoxy or New Orthodoxy in Germany in the second half of the 19th century. He never called it that. He never called it Enlightened Judaism. As far as Rav Hirsch was concerned, it was simply Judaism or Torah. He didn't see anything new about it. In fact, one of the things that we'll speak about tonight is that as far as Rav Hirsch was concerned, he was just going back to the roots of authentic Judaism and actually going back to where it should have been had time not intervened and changed things. So he was born in 1808 in Hamburg. He studied with Hamburg Nays, who was the Rav in Hamburg, a very interesting figure who deserves a shiur all of his own. He studied in a classical gymnasium as an adolescent. At the age of 13, he was sent off to one of the only yeshivot that then existed in Germany, the yeshiva of Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, another very interesting character. After a few years, he went to university. Unlike some of the other rabbis in Germany, he did not complete his university degree. He only spent 1 year in university studying classical languages, literature, and physics, which is an interesting combination. At the age of 22, he was appointed the Rav of the city of Oldenburg, which is a city in northwest Germany. Very humbling if you look at it. Before the age of 30, he had completed two of his most important works. First, the 19 Letters. The 19 Letters is a series of anonymous letters. At first, they were published anonymously, which Rav Hirsch wrote to a fictional person in Naphtali who had been influenced by the Jewish Enlightenment, by the Haskalah, and by the Reform movement, and Rav Hirsch used these 19 letters as a means of trying to help Naphtali be introduced to what he considered to be authentic Judaism. And then a year later, he wrote Chorev, which was his introduction to Judaism, to all the rituals and halachot of Judaism, for a largely unschooled, largely ignorant Jewish population of mid-19th century Germany. In 1841, he was appointed the chief rabbi of two other cities in northwest Germany, Ulrich and Osnabrück. And for the first time that we know of, he used the words Torah and Derech Eretz, which we will spend a lot of time talking about tonight, which was basically his approach to the educational program of Judaism and what Jews should and should not be spending their time studying during their lives. In 1846, he became the rabbi of Nikolsburg, which was in what is now the Czech Republic, and soon became the Landesrabbiner of Moravia and Silesia, two provinces in Moravia is modern-day Czech Republic. Silesia is partly Poland, partly Germany. As Landesrabbiner, he was responsible for all Jews in those communities, whether they were Orthodox Jews or Reform Jews or whatever. All Jews looked upon him as the leader of the community. And he found lots of opposition. On the one hand, the more traditional people within these towns found him much too modern. He wore modern dress. He did not dress in normal, what was considered to be Eastern or Central European rabbinical clothing. He broadened the school curriculum to include some secular studies. And this won't sound all that radical, but it was radical in the 1840s. He allowed weddings to be held in shul. What's the big deal about holding a wedding in shul? The Chassam Sofer had poskin that it's usher to have a wedding in a shul. Why? Because in Central Europe, with the beginning of the Reform movement and Haskalah, and an attempt to make Judaism conform more to the Christianity that the Jews saw around them, they began making weddings in shuls, just as all Christian weddings were always in churches. So the Chassam Sofer poskin that it was usher to do that. Rav Hirsch did not see any objection to it, but he got a lot of flack from it from some of the more traditionalist figures. But he also got a lot more flack from the people on the left, from the Reform, because he was strictly and stridently halachic and orthodox, and refused to make any of the changes in the liturgy that were being made by the Reform movement at that time. And then in 1851, he did something very risky for a career. He left his job as the Landesrabbiner, and he accepted the invitation to move to Frankfurt. Frankfurt at the time was a city which included about 5,000 Jews, and you all know some very important Jews. That was where the Rothschilds started. It was a city of 5,000 Jews, almost exclusively made up of members of what were then Reform congregations. 11 families out of all those 5,000 Jews decided to break away from the community and invited Rav Hirsch to come to Frankfurt and to be their Rav. And that was very, very, very problematic for two reasons. So this became known as the Austrittsgemeinde, the secessionist community. What's the big deal? I daven in a shul, well, it's not a shul, I daven with a bunch of guys on Friday nights in someone's house, and then at Simchas Torah, some of the people got insulted, so we had a breakaway minion from the breakaway minion, and I daven in the breakaway from the breakaway, and if one day the guy whose house it's in doesn't say good Shabbos nicely to somebody else, there'll be a third breakaway. In Ashkenaz, in Germany, that was much more problematic for two reasons. There was a very, very strong tradition in Germany of Mar D'Asra, that there is only one Rav who is responsible for the entire community, and nobody else is allowed to mess with his turf. So the idea of breaking away from the community and forming one's own community was problematic, but it was also a legal issue. In Germany in the 19th century, everybody had to belong to a religious community. You belonged to a Protestant community, a Catholic community, or a Jewish community, and you paid taxes to that community, and you were identified publicly as a member of that community. And in order to be allowed to break away and form their own community, they had to get special permission from the government of Frankfurt, which was still an independent city in 1851. It had not yet become part of Prussia. They had to get permission from the Senate of Frankfurt to form their own community, and they were given partial community. They weren't allowed to create a real community in the sense that the other official ones were, but they were allowed to set up what was known as the Israelitische Religionsgesellschaft, a religious society. Not a Gemeinde, not a Kehillah, not an official organization, but a society of Jews that wanted to remain separate. And this led to lots of conflict. In fact, many of the rabbis throughout Germany, some of whom were much, much more right-wing in many ways than Rav Hirsch, and who disapproved of his ideas of Torah and Derech Eretz, felt that one should never break away from the community, perhaps only for tactical reasons, thinking that as long as they stayed within the community, they might have influence. Rav Hirsch had come to the point that he decided that he no longer wanted to be responsible for the entire spectrum of Jews. He wanted to be responsible only for a small number of Jews and to create what he considered to be an ideal community. So he started with 11 families in 1851. By the time he died in 1888, he had 400 families. A shul called Kahal Hadash Yeshurun, as this, all shuls throughout the world that are the descendants of Rav Hirsch Shul in Frankfurt are called, was seated 1,000. He had 1,000 elementary school children and 500 high school children, all within the Frankfurt community. During that time, he also wrote some of his most important works. He wrote his Perush on Chumash, his Perush on Tehillim, and on the Siddur. And he also published a periodical called Yeshurun, which includes most of his most important articles. Which leads me to mention to you, when we look at the sources as we go through them, two things. First of all, I did label each of the sources with a Hebrew letter. What I stupidly forgot to do was number the pages, so I will try to refer you as we go along. But second of all, Rav Hirsch wrote in German. Almost everything that he wrote in German. So I was tempted to give you the sources in German. I decided to spare you that. So some of them are in English and some of them are in Hebrew, and that's simply a matter of happenstance. The ones that I happen to come across first in English, I used in English. The ones that I happen to come across first in Hebrew, I used in Hebrew. He's easier to deal with in Hebrew than in English. His German was very, very flowery and dense, as German often is, 19th century German. And some of the early English translations sounded like German with English words. It's only some of the more modern, there's a new, more modern translation of his Perush on the Chumash, which is actually very good. But there is a Hebrew translation of his Chumash commentary by Rav Breuer, which was done in Israel in Hebrew, which is excellent, and where I've used his Chumash, I've tried to use that. Finally, besides writing all that stuff, he also wrote Chidushei Torah, and he also wrote Shuvos. And anyone who is competent to make such judgments will tell you that he held his own with the Gedolim of Eastern Europe. His Torah was at the level of the Torah of Eastern European Rosh Yeshiva, and he was able to deal with that material on the same level they were. He was a first-grade Talmud Chacham. But unlike the Rosh Yeshiva in Eastern Europe, he did not see his primary role as creating Rabbanim and Gedolim and perpetuating high level of learning and dealing with the elite. He looked upon his goal as dealing with the masses. So if you look at the first page of source number bet, our century, and we'll talk about it in a minute, remember this is the century which is immediately after the Enlightenment period, which we'll talk about. Our century wants to think, and that is the greatest merit. Whatever can be rationally explained and is capable of being presented as idea and concept and can stand the test of rational thinking has nothing to fear. But one can only analyze, test, and mediate upon things with which one is acquainted. Among Jews, however, nothing is less well known than Judaism itself. I dare submit that Judaism, as it appears to me, to intellectual analysis, I shall perhaps be blamed for it from all sides. And he goes on to where the next bracket is. As it is, however, I see an older generation, which Judaism has become an inherited mummy. A generation which shows veneration for Judaism, it is true, but a veneration without spirit. Some of that generation, therefore, see only tombstone inscriptions in Judaism, and thus despair of the internal validity of the only thing that makes life worth living. As I'll mention later, he felt that most German Jews, including those Jews who were most traditional, were living a life of what he called anashim mitzvot melumada, which basically meant they were going through the motions of religion, trying very hard to do exactly what they were supposed to do, without understanding anything about what they were doing, and more importantly, understanding why they were doing what they were doing. On the other hand, he says, I see a younger generation aglow with noble enthusiasm for Judaism, or rather for Jews. These young men do not know about authentic Judaism, and what they believe they know of it, they consider as empty forms without meaning. One must admit, however, that this ignorance is not entirely their fault, and he goes on to say, somewhat egotistically, I would say, that there's nobody else in Germany at this point who's able to remedy the situation, so in a place where there's nobody else to do it, I'm going to have to step in and do it, and I'm going to save authentic Judaism in Germany. So what do we know about Judaism in Germany in the 19th century? First of all, we have to remember that emancipation did not come to all of Germany until 1870. That is, until 1870, there were still places in Germany where Jews were officially second-class, not even citizens, second-class inhabitants, where they were restricted in terms of where they could live, they were restricted in terms of their occupations, they paid special taxes, etc., etc. So for instance, in Frankfurt, where he came in 1851, full emancipation did not come until 15 years later in 1866, when Frankfurt became part of the Kingdom of Prussia, much against the will of Frankfurt. And only then was there full emancipation. But all of Germany was not emancipated until 1870 with the official proclamation of the German Reich, the German Empire, under the auspices of Prussia. So many of the Jews that he dealt with were living in a situation, for instance, in the city where I did my research, the city of Lübeck, until 1848, Jews were allowed to come to town every day to do business. They had to be out of the city by dusk. The gates of the city, this was a city that actually still had walls, the gates of the city were actually locked, and Jews were only allowed to live in a little town called Meusling, several miles away from Lübeck. It was only in 1848, when there was a revolution in Lübeck, and Jews were able to begin living there, and I actually found some fascinating documents. When Jews finally became citizens of Lübeck, they suddenly needed to have last names. The Jews never had last names. And suddenly, within a period of days, every Jew in Lübeck, there were only several hundred of them, had to come up with a name for themselves. And how they came up with these names was very fascinating. Not surprisingly, it often was either occupational, like Schneider or Fleischer or something like that, or it was where they originally came from, Frankfurt or Hamburg or Berliner, etc., things like that. So that's the Germany they lived in. It's also the Germany of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, by the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century already, in the upper classes, starting in the Netherlands and then in northern Germany, Jews, wealthy Jews, upper class Jews, had begun to assimilate in the ways that you'd expect. It started with language, and then it went to dress and hairstyles and beards and stuff like that. But slowly but surely, more and more assimilation. And one of the things that almost always accompanied assimilation in Europe was a decision in the relatively short term that Tersh didn't count. That to be Jewish only meant to follow the laws of the Torah, but rabbinic law, the laws of the Talmud, really did not apply. And slowly but surely, you have a movement away from halacha on the part of lots of the wealthier Jews in northern Germany and the Netherlands. Then along comes the European Enlightenment. And the European Enlightenment basically says, we're all the same. All human beings are the same. And we all have the same ability to hook into what's called natural religion. Natural religion means each of us was endowed by God. They were deists. They believed in God. They just didn't believe in a God that actually intervened in the world and kept the world going from day to day. They basically believed that God created the world and then had gone on vacation for the rest of eternity. I used to be able to say he went to Grossinger's or Concord, but that doesn't exist anymore, obviously. And the idea was, one doesn't need organized religion in order to be good, because it's all implanted, as if we have chips in our brains that were implanted by God at the creation of humanity, and all human beings are capable of being good, and therefore human beings are equal. Well, if all human beings are equal, and you're not Jewish, and you're living in Europe in the 18th century, it ought to make sense that if all human beings are equal, and Jews are human beings, Jews ought to be equal also. So you would have expected the Enlightenment to be pushing very hard to emancipate the Jews, long before the French Revolution began doing that in the 1790s and the beginning of the Napoleonic era in the first decade of the 19th century. But when even the most enlightened of the Enlightenment people looked at the Jews, they couldn't completely divest themselves of their 1,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism in Europe. But they also looked at the Jews, and again, we're going to get to it next week when we read the Megillah. Here's these people. They're different from everybody else. They don't follow the same laws. In other words, they could have just been copying exactly what Haman says to Achashverosh. They don't deserve equality. They're different. They want to be different. So what the Enlightenment started to say, or the most enlightened people in the Enlightenment started saying is, you know what? We'll let the Jews in, but only new improved Jews. What does new improved Jews mean? New improved Jews means begin to divest yourselves of your own religious differences. Allow yourselves to be managed by the non-Jewish world. That is, you can't keep your books and business in Yiddish or in Hebrew anymore. We want to make sure that your books are like everybody else's so that we can take a look and make sure that you're being honest. And we want you to send your kids to school. And we don't want you all to be money lenders and bankers. We want you to teach your kids to be blacksmiths and shoemakers, etc., become part of the world that we're in. A lot of Jews looked at this and said, yeah, right, we need to do that. We should become more like everybody else, and we'll look at that in a second. And the most famous one of those people was Moses Mendelssohn. And Moses Mendelssohn was a truly enlightened person, but he was a frum guy. And all would have eaten in his house, even on Shabbos, and not even worried about how he was heating up stuff on Shabbos. He was 100% the halachic Jew. I'm sure he put on tefillin every morning of his life and davened with a minyan 3 times a day. But Mendelssohn believed that the Torah was very different from how we understand the Torah. Mendelssohn believed that the Torah was what he called revealed legislation. In other words, God gave us the Torah, 613 mitzvot. And we have to obey those mitzvot, because all of us, in one way or another, were standing under Har Sinai when the Torah was given. So it's incumbent upon all Jews forevermore to keep that Torah. But the Torah was only meant to help us find natural religion more easily. If we learn to restrain our activities, if we learn to behave ourselves according to the mitzvah ben Adam lachavero and be more ethical people, we have a leg up on the rest of the world, and we can become enlightened people more quickly than everybody else. But the Torah is not meant to teach us any lessons. Our value system, Mendelssohn argued, is the same value system as everybody else in the European world. And he's the one about whom, I'm not sure he invented the phrase, but it was used about him, to be a man in the street and a Jew at home. And a man in the street, a Jew at home, didn't simply mean dressing like everybody else. It meant basically, you are a modern, enlightened German of the 1780s, but you don't eat cheeseburgers, and once a year you wave this palm branch around, and there's certain days that you can eat and certain days that you can't eat, but that's all private at home. In terms of your value system, you're exactly like everybody else. As his legacy continued, we get people who are not frum, but who believe this, and are ready to take him at his word and basically say, wait a second. If the goal is natural religion, and the goal is to be good, I can be good without all those mitzvos. I don't need that. Because my neighbor who started out as a Christian doesn't have any of those mitzvos. He's an enlightened figure. He's very, very ethical. I can become ethical like him. Till you get to near the end of the process, where you get a guy named David Friedlander, who was a businessman but was very involved in Jewish communal affairs and very, very important in the early Reform movement, who writes a letter to one of the local Lutheran clergymen, a very liberal Christian, and he says to him, listen, I understand that in European society, the only real ticket to European society is a baptismal certificate. I understand that. But you know, you don't really believe in all that Christianity stuff, any more than we really believe in all this Judaism stuff. So you pick a Sunday, any Sunday, and I'll line up all the Jewish kids you want, and they'll march into your church, and you'll sprinkle water on them, you'll do whatever it is that you need to do to them, and we'll convert them all to Christianity, and they'll get their baptismal certificate, and they'll have entree into German society. I don't think he said that they were going to keep their fingers crossed behind their back saying, I'm not Makabel or not Makabel. But what he basically said was, you don't believe in Christianity, we don't believe in Judaism, let's all be friends. And this clergyman, his name was Teller, had the integrity to say to him, and listen, Chevraman, liberal, yes, liberal, but this is still the Church of Jesus Christ. And if you want entree into it, you're not going to just get some water sprinkled on it. You have to at least mouth the words and saying you accepted the other religion. That they weren't to do. What you also have happening during this period is, Mendelssohn was a fascinating guy. I'll just intersperse a probably apocryphal story about him. He was so much part of the Enlightenment world of Berlin that he actually was often invited to the court of Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. But Mendelssohn, in a very un-Yeckish kind of way, was never on time. And you can imagine the King of Prussia wasn't going to deal well with a guy who doesn't hold from punctuality. So the story goes that one day Mendelssohn showed up late for something. The king whipped out a piece of paper and scribbled on a piece of paper and handed it to Mendelssohn. And on the paper he'd written, Mendelssohn ist ein Esel, Mendelssohn is an ass, and he signed it with his dynastic name, Friedrich II, Frederick II. Now those of you who know Yiddish or German know that the word ein means the indefinite article, but also can be used as the number one, as in 1, 2, 3, right? You all know that. So Mendelssohn supposedly took the piece of paper that the king had sent to him, and he reads it out loud. Mendelssohn ist ein Esel, Friedrich II, which means Mendelssohn is one ass, Frederick II. It's probably not true, because as far as we know, Mendelssohn had his head attached to him when he died. So it's unlikely that he actually did this. But he was close enough to the king and to the enlightened circles of his time. And Friedrich was one of these guys who was known as an enlightened despot. He messed around with the Enlightenment people, that he really had a lot of influence. This was also a period of schmad. In Berlin, in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, extraordinary numbers of mainly young Jews just converted to Christianity. Mostly out of convenience. Mostly because they didn't take any religion seriously. So giving up Judaism meant nothing to them. Accepting another religion that they weren't going to pay any attention to that meant nothing to them as well. But there were also some romantic converts. Some converts who actually did it lishma. Amongst them, Mendelssohn's daughters. And you all know the famous composer, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, was the grandson of Mendelssohn. He was brought up as a Catholic. And there is a story, and I've read articles on it, that actually a direct descendant of Mendelssohn, but we're talking about 5, 6 generations later, so this was acceptable, was actually a colonel in the Gestapo. Okay. This was also the age of the Reform movement. Okay. And the Reform movement, as you understand, started out by, I'll take too much time on this. The Reform movement started out first by changing doesn't sound all that radical, changing the sermon from Yiddish to German, but slowly but surely they changed the liturgy. They did away with anything that had to do with going back to Eretz Yisrael and Karbanot, because they wanted to make sure that they did not appear to, it's in the news in the States right now, they didn't want to appear to have dual allegiance. They didn't want to look like that somehow, what are you telling us? You want to be part of German society if 3 times a day you can stand before God and ask him, please get us the heck out of there and send us to another country. And exceeding, etc., can organ, the choirs, the whole business. So this is the milieu in which he was growing, in which Hirsch was working. Hirsch decided that he wanted to create what he called scientific Judaism, based on sources which would be appealing to educated German Jews, and to do it in such a way that he was not involved in any outside influences, but actually starting from Judaism itself. So on the top of the first page, he divided Judaism into 6 categories. So first is Toros. Toros simply means basic theological ideas. Ani Hashem Elokecha, not to worship idols, etc. The unity and oneness of God. That's easy. Then Mishpatim. Mishpatim is exactly what it sounds like. It's the laws that you find, first and foremost, starting in the Parashat Mishpatim, the civic law of Judaism, of how to treat one another in terms of monetary things, etc. Then Chukim was very interesting. Chukim, he said, if Mishpatim tells us how to treat other people, Chukim tells us how to treat other things. So the whole idea of Bal Tashkis, the whole idea of not being allowed to cut down trees when you're laying siege to a city, things like that, even shatnez, that somehow God had something in mind about the relationship of linen and wool that God understood was improper. These are chukim. They're to teach us to treat inanimate objects, to treat our possessions, all as creations of God, and to treat them respectfully. Mitzvot are basically forms of interpersonal relations that have nothing to do with money and business. Kibur ava'en, v'hadarta pnei zaken, to treat elderly people well, etc. And then finally there was, then Eidos. Eidos are symbolic observances, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, but he said Shabbat, Chagim, Truma, Bechor, all those kinds of things, all these ritual, ceremonial kinds of things, for Hirsch had tremendous intrinsic value and needed to be explained. And here he differs from the Rambam. And this becomes very important. We'll talk much more about this in a moment. The Rambam, of course, was known for giving Tamei mitzvot, for trying to explain the reasons for the mitzvot. Sometimes practical reasons, sometimes spiritual reasons, but he rarely gave explanations for the details of the mitzvah. So for instance, Rambam writes that tzitzit and tefillin remind us to acknowledge, love, and revere God. He tells us that circumcision, the bris milah, weakens sexual desire and is a marker for the Jewish people. And then the Rambam in Mishnah Torah gives us all the details of halacha, but he never explains any of those details. Hirsch thought it was very important to explain those details, because it's those details that make up halacha that we live by, and if we don't find significance in them, how we can convince people to actually pay attention to them. So he said, for instance, why do you put on the tefillin shel yad before you put on the tefillin shel rosh? Because the shel yad is dedicated to our actions, the shel rosh is dedicated to our thoughts, and action is much more important than theoretical speculation, about which he had all kinds of issues, which we'll discuss, and therefore the shel yad has to go first. Why do we wear tzitzit as a beged? Because garments represent the first sin. When Adam and Chava sin, the first thing God does is he gives them clothing to wear. And it's not only clothing, it's special clothing. So the tzitzit are blue and white with a string of tchelet. The white, he tells us, represented universalism. The blue represented Jewish particularism, and the tzitzit unites that universalism and the particularism. The knots on the tzitzit show us that God and the Torah restrains humanity by giving us a way of life. But the strings which hang loose also teach us that Torah allows human freedom to flourish. And he gave these kinds of reasons. Why do we only do Brit Milah during the day? Why do we only bring Karbanot during the day? Because the day is the time of human creativity and optimism as opposed to nighttime. So we want to do these things during the day when people are most creative and most optimistic about their lives. And he insisted very much upon doing this. But he had to deal with the Haskalah. He had to deal with the Enlightenment. So please look at the fourth page, which I guess is the third page, I guess, which is, since you have it back to back, it's the top. You flip to the top of this second page. It's the letter Dalet from the very beginning. Every religion, I believe, should bring man nearer to his ultimate end. And he's writing here as if he were a maskil, as if he were a child of the Jewish Enlightenment, as if he were one of those German Jews who was turning away from observance. But if we take these principles as a criterion for Judaism, what utterly depressing results do we not obtain? To what happiness does Judaism conduct its professors? From time immemorial, misery and slavery have been their lot, misunderstood or despised by the other nations. While the rest of mankind mounted to the summit of culture, prosperity, and fortune, its adherents remained always poor in everything which makes human beings great and noble. And then we go to the next paragraph, where it's underlined, in a word, what great achievements have Jews wrought compared with Egyptians, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Italians, French, English, or Germans? Then to the next paragraph, where he talks about this never-ending chain of misery that Jews in Germany saw Judaism. The law is chiefly at fault for all of this, by enjoining isolation in life and thereby arousing suspicion and hostility by breaking the spirit. It discourages the pursuit of formative arts, by dogmas which bar the way of free speculation, by removing through the separation in life every incentive to exertion in science and art, which therefore do not flourish amongst us. I have always wondered, the Maskil says to him, not a little of how you, that is, the person who's writing these letters, have a taste and understanding for the beauties of Virgil, Tasso, and Shakespeare, and were able to penetrate into the consistent structures of Leibniz or Kant, can find pleasures in the rude and tasteless writings of the Old Testament, or in the ideological disputations of the Talmud. The broad principles of universal morality are narrowed into anxious scrupulosity, what a word, about insignificant trifles. Nothing is taught except fear for God. Nothing but prayers and ceremonies. He, the most praiseworthy Jew, who lives most secluded, knows least of the world, wastes his life in fasting and praying and the perusal of senseless writings. Where is there one word of the active, busy life around us? Why, it's quite impossible to keep these laws intended for an entirely different time. What limitations in traveling, what embarrassment in association with Gentiles, what difficulties in every business. Now, this has some contemporary resonance. I think there are a lot of Jews in North America who might feel very much the same way about Judaism, but certainly this was rampant in the time of Mendelssohn. So you read other places, for instance, and this is almost one of the great attacks on Judaism, on observant Judaism that you always find. One of the Maskilim writes, I know this guy who lives in Berlin who is the frummest guy in the world. The way he expressed it, he wouldn't put a morsel of bread into his mouth without making a bracha before and a blessing afterwards. Yet he has a brother who lost all of his money and he was suffering and he turned a blind eye to his brother. That's religion. Or don't they understand that there is, yes, there's Chachma in the Torah, but there's also Chachmat Adam. There is a whole way of life out there. There's culture, there's civility, there's etiquette, there are ways of dealing with the world, and we Jews don't know anything about it. Those Enlightenment figures who say that we need to be improved, they're 100% right. And this is the Judaism that he needed to deal with. But it's very interesting, and he wrote stuff that I wouldn't dare say out loud, as we'll see in a moment, if it weren't written by someone like Rav Hirsch. If you turn to page Gimel, that's I guess the flip of the back of the first page. So first he starts talking about Mendelssohn. This commanding individual who had not drawn his mental development from Judaism, who was great chiefly in philosophical disciplines and metaphysics and aesthetics, who treated the Bible only philosophically and aesthetically, and did not build up Judaism as a science from itself, but merely defended it against political stupidity and pietistic Christian audacity, and who was personally an observant Jew, accomplished this much, that he showed the world and his brethren that it is possible to be a strictly religious Jew and yet to shine distinguished as the German Plato. This and yet was decisive. And he talks about the fact that he never, even the most zealous study of the Bible was no avail for the comprehension of Judaism, which was not treated as the authoritative source of doctrine and instruction, but only as a beautiful poetic storehouse from which to draw rich supplies for the fancy and the imagination. The Talmud was neglected. Practical Judaism was therefore completely uncomprehended. And he goes on, the second column, if, for instance, the sole purpose of the prohibition of labor on the Sabbath was to enable men to rest and recover from the toils of the week, if the Sabbath means only the cessation of corporeal activity in order that the mind may be active, and who could doubt it, since both Moses, meaning Moses Mendelssohn, and Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, both interpreted thus, and the Christian Sunday agrees with this conception, who must not consider it mere pettiness and pedantic absurdity to fill an entire folio, an entire Masechta, with the investigation of the question, what particular actions are forbidden and what permitted on the Sabbath day. And if you go to the end of that paragraph, there seems to be something that a lot of enlightened people must have hooked onto, because Hurch mentioned it many times, why it even forbids the hen to lay eggs. Obviously, there's no halacha that it's usher for a hen to lay eggs on Chavez, but we do know that if a hen lays eggs on Chavez, we're not allowed to use it on Chavez, and they saw that as the height of ridiculousness, that somehow we have to be limited in our activity because the hen decided to lay its egg on Chavez rather than on Friday afternoon. People should have asked themselves, and again, only Rav Hirsch could write this, I would never say this, is Moses the son of Maimon, or Moses the son of Mendelssohn, really identical with Moses the son of Amram? Is there not considered in this dissonance between the theory of the mitzvah and its reality a proof that the explanation is not right? And then if you go to source Vav, which I guess is on page, sorry about this folks, page 4, which means the back of the second page, if you go to the right side of the page, the age, meaning the late Middle Ages, gave birth to a mind who the product of uncomprehended Judaism and Arabic science. So he's starting to describe the Rambam as a mind who's the product of uncomprehended Judaism, was obliged to reconcile the strife which raged within his own breast in his own manner, and who by proclaiming it to the world became the guide of all whom the same conflict existed. This great man, and he admits, to whom alone we owe the preservation of practical Judaism in our time, by writing Mishnah Torah, obviously, is responsible because he sought to reconcile Judaism with the difficulties which confronted it from without, instead of developing it creatively from within. And what he basically said about the Rambam is this. The Rambam studied Greek philosophy and came to the conclusion that Aristotle was the wisest man that ever lived. He came to the conclusion that the basic ideas of Aristotle were true. And then, according to Hirsch, he took those ideas, decided that they are true, and then imposed them upon Torah. In other words, he took foreign ideas and he imposed them on Torah and came to the conclusion that, like Greek philosophers, the only goal in life is seeking the truth. And therefore, all the details of halacha have no importance. All of this is basically seeking the truth. So if you look at the bottom of the left part of that page, instead of comprehending each demand in its totality, according to the Bible and Talmud, and then asking what is the reason and idea for this injunction, people set up their standpoints outside of Judaism and sought to draw it over to them. They conceived of a priori opinions as to what mitzvot might be. So he blames, this is astounding. Now, he's not the first person who ever attacked the Rambam. The Rava did a wonderful job attacking the Rambam in his time. And if you all know the kina that we say on Tisha B'Av about the burning of the Talmud in the middle of the 13th century in Paris, there's a rabbinic tradition that was midah keneged midah, that was a punishment that was inflicted by God upon the Jews of France, because in previous generations they had burned the Rambam because they felt the Rambam was heretical, and God was getting even with them and having wagon loads of Talmud. Remember, this was before the printing press. So wagon loads of Talmud meant irreplaceable folios of the Talmud were being consigned to the flames. So he's not the first one. But in the 19th century, for someone to come along and basically say it was basically the Rambam's fault, and Mendelssohn is just following with the Rambam, that's very, very, very harsh, but very, very clear in his thinking. So one of the biggest issues that he dealt with was this idea that we have to change that whole mindset. And he said, Mendelssohn and Rambam, you were wrong. This is not revealed legislation. This is revealed instruction. Every bit of Torah has a value. Every halacha has a value system built into it. And it wasn't meant so that I could privately be a Jew at home and in the rest of my life I do what I'm like everybody else. You're never like everybody else. Your Judaism is supposed to pervade every aspect of your life in your modern life. So very much he was dealing with very much the same issues that we deal with in a way in the modern Orthodox community, where it's not all that difficult to compartmentalize ourselves into a religious persona and a secular persona. Almost the image of the person coming home from work, an hour before Shabbos on Friday afternoon and taking off his or her work clothes and donning on Shabbos clothes, and so for 25 hours my religious persona dominates, but as soon as I get back to the office on Monday morning I'm just like everybody else, and my value system is the same as everybody else's, but I don't eat cheeseburgers, and you're gonna have to bring, and we have lunch, you have to bring me stuff wrapped in cellophane, so I could be very embarrassed when I try to unwrap it, and it makes a lot of noise. But he was dealing very much with that issue of making sure that people understood that that's not what Judaism is all about. He also was very insistent that it was usher to deal with the Reform movement. He felt that it's perfectly okay to learn from non-Jews, and he accepted the Rambam's idea of that you take truth from whomever said it, but that's only from the non-Jewish world. From people who deny the authority of Torah, the people who he considered to be heretical, one should not cooperate with them or work with them in any way. If you look at source number A, what he talks about is, compare with this view the tendencies of contemporary reform. Be wroth with none, don't be angry at them, respect all, for they all feel the shortcomings which exist. Now, he admitted that the Reform movement was dealing with the same issues that he was dealing with their unhappiness for what was happening in the Jewish community in Germany in the early 19th century. All wish that which is good as they conceive it. All desire sincerely the welfare of Israel. And if they have failed to recognize the good and have erred in their comprehension of the truth, nor are they chiefly to blame. The entire past bears their responsibility together with them. You should therefore respect their intentions, but you may well mourn and weep when you examine the aims to which their efforts are directed. Is that the reform we need? To take a standpoint outside of Judaism, to accept a conception derived from strangers of the purpose of human life and the object of liberty, and then in correspondence with this borrowed notion to cut, curtail, obliterate the tenets and ordinances of Judaism. In other words, as far as he was concerned, the Reform movement didn't even have its own internal integrity. It's not like they came up with their own new philosophical perspective on Judaism. He said, you decided that we need to be just like the Goyim, so you're taking Judaism and changing everything you can within Judaism so we will be more like the rest of the people around us. But you're not doing it as a matter of principle. You're doing it because you decided that you don't care about halacha, that you don't believe in Torah Shabbal Peh, so you're going to change whatever you want to change. And that's what the Reform movement, as far as he was concerned. He even quoted a Gemara. It's a Gemara in Chavez, Daf Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph, which says that if someone is fleeing someone who's trying to kill him, one is permitted to take refuge in a house of idol worship. So you could run into a Roman temple and to save yourself, but you're not allowed, and I don't know if this is the halacha or only an agadic statement, you're not allowed to run into the house of kofrim, into the house of heretics who deny the Torah, even to save yourself. So probably the halacha, that's not the actual halacha, but the point was very clear that this Gemara was saying that, and that it was very, very important to do that. So that was his basic term. Now, and therefore it's very easy to see why he felt it necessary to break away. Now I want to talk about some other things that people know less about him. What time is this supposed to end? 9. 9, okay. Oh yeah, okay. Look at number Zion. That's page, I guess page 5. Zion. I'm going to read it out loud and you tell me what this is talking about. On the very eve of the exile, meaning just about the time of Churban Bayit Sheni, meaning 2,000 years ago, a branch left the parent tree, which was obliged to surrender largely the characteristics of the parent stem in order to bring to the world, which had relapsed into polytheism, violence, immorality, and inhumanity, the tidings of the existence of the All-One and of the brotherhood of man and his superiority to the beast, and to proclaim the deliverance of mankind from the bondage of wealth and lust worship. Assisted greatly by this offshoot in rendering intelligible to the world the object and purposes of Israel's election, the nation, meaning the Jews, was scattered into the 4 quarters of the earth unto all peoples and zones in order that in the dispersion it might better fulfill the mission. What's this talking about?
Is there a reason? Is there a reason?
To be a light unto the nation.
It's talking about Christianity.
Right?
This is basically, again, you don't expect this to find this, but there was a universalistic streak to Rav Hirsch. This is basically saying that Christianity was a good thing. That Christianity is a branch which left the parent tree and which changed the world. In a world, the Roman world, filled with polytheism and violence and lust, they civilized the Roman world, they civilized the pagan world, and even made it possible in the long run for Jews to fulfill their mission. So well over 100 years before anyone in America was talking about such a thing as a Judeo-Christian ethic, Hirsch was already talking about it. And he was very, very much into this universalism. Is God not the loving Father of all creatures, of all human beings? The view of Judaism is that every human being, regardless of class, sex, we'll get back to that maybe, or nationality, is capable of intellectual and moral perfection. Practice righteousness and love as the Holy Torah bids you. Bear love in your heart for your non-Jewish brethren, as your law teaches you. Feed his hungry, clothe his, etc. So a real universalistic streak, which is not surprising for someone in 19th century Germany who was still trying to fit into German society, but very, very different from what you would have read from most of Gedolei Israel in the 19th century in Eastern Europe. And another thing about him, in 1930, way after Rav Hirsch was done, there was an entire conflict that broke out in Poland, started by Rav Aaron Kotler. Rav Aaron Kotler, of course, was the one who eventually came to America and was the founder of Beis Medrash Gavoa of the Lakewood Yeshiva. And he attacked anybody in Poland, including some popular newspapers, that had the audacity to criticize the Avos, who had the audacity to criticize that anything that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or any of the other major biblical figures did in the Torah. And we know there's something of a tradition to that. For instance, the famous story about David and about Sheva, and the Gemara says that anyone who says that David sinned is making a mistake, but not everybody agrees with that. So look at source Chet, which I actually translated from the Hebrew. And again, something that I would never dare say. Our sages never refrained from revealing weaknesses and errors, large or small, in the actions of our great patriarchs and matriarchs. And in doing so, they emphasized the lessons which are to be learned from them. Here too, one comment in Midrash Bereshit Rabbah demonstrates that the profound difference between Avram's two grandsons was based not only on differences in personality, but also on their defective education. When the boys were little, no one paid attention to their hidden inclinations. They supplied both of them with one Torah, with one form of education, and they forgot the great educational principle of Chanoch Lanar al pi darko, educate each child according to his way. One should be educated in a manner which corresponds to the characteristics and inclinations which are dormant in the depths of a child's soul, so that the child can be supplied with an education which is simultaneously pure, humanistic, and Jewish. All Jews have the same religious goal, but the ways to reach that goal are many and variegated, just as different people's personalities differ from one another. Just skip one sentence. Sitting Yaakov and Esav on the same school bench and utilizing the same methodology and approach for both will inevitably ruin one of them. Yaakov will draw eagerly from the fount of wisdom, and Esav will wait for the day when he can throw away both his old school books and the way of life of which he was only shown one side, which he abhors. If Yitzchak and Rivka had only tried to really understand their son Esav, if they had started out by asking themselves how all of Esav's strengths and talents could be marshaled for the purpose of serving God, his heroism might not have been expressed as Gibor Tzayid, the mighty hunter, but instead of Gibor Lefnei Hashem, a hero in the presence of God. And alas, that's not what happened. When the boys grew up and became men, everybody was suddenly surprised to find that these two individuals who developed in the same womb, grew up together and were educated together, turned out so different, not only in their natures, but also in their actions and lifestyles. So he's blaming, just think about it, think about who Esav is. Esav, Edom, represents, in rabbinic thought, the enemy. The Medrash says, Esav sonei Yaakov, that's a fact of life, that Esav is the enemy of the Jewish people. And here you have Rav Hirsch saying, it's because Yitzchak and Rivka blew it. If Yitzchak and Rivka had only educated Yaakov and Esav properly and recognized who Esav was and used his strengths and personality in a positive way, he could have turned out to be a different kind of frum guy than Yaakov, but a frum guy also, and certainly not the enemy of Am Yisrael for the rest of history. That's amazing. Now, he's not the first to say this kind of stuff. The second paragraph is based on the Ramban. The Ramban in Lech Lecha says that when Avram went down to Egypt during the famine, he was sinning, inadvertently was sinning, but he should have had enough faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu that if God brought me to Eretz Canaan, he will also sustain me in time of famine. And secondly, by telling Sarah to play this game, to say that you're my sister, he was endangering her and putting her in a position where she would be forced to sin, because after all, she was a married woman, and Pyro's going to take her, and what's going to happen? So the Ramban clearly says that Abraham acted improperly, and Hirsch follows up on that. The Torah never presents our great men as being perfect. It deifies no man, says of none, here you have the ideal, and this man, the divine, became human. And the Torah, and in fact he goes on to say, I'm not going to read it because I want to get some other stuff, he basically goes on to say, if the Torah presented the Avos as angelic figures, we couldn't hope to emulate them. They'd be much less instructive. And as far as Hirsch was concerned, every bit of Torah is meant to be instructive. We're supposed to learn something from it. What can we learn from a bunch of angels? We know that we can't be angels. I also want to show you something about his incredible sense of history. That's on the right side of that same page. So you'll remember the story. Leah gets kidnapped and sexually abused. The brothers storm into the city of Shechem. Dinah, I'm sorry. Dinah is kidnapped and raped. The brothers storm into the city. The father of the kidnapper tries to reason with them, and he says to them, why don't we live together, be one happy family? Our sons will marry your daughters, your sons will marry our daughters, fine. And the sons and Yaakov's sons say, fine, we can do that, but it's beneath our dignity to live with people who are uncircumcised. If you all get circumcised, fine. They all get circumcised. 3 days later, when they're all not yet recuperated, in comes Shimon and Levi, and they kill everybody in Shem. So now we have the pasuk from Vayishlach. What's Yaakov's reaction? Ram Yaakov Shimon Levi, Achartem oti lahavisheni b'yoshev haaretz haknani v'aprizi v'ani metei mispar v'nesfu alai v'ikuni v'nishmateni v'eiti. You've brought me down, you've made me contemptuous in the eyes of my neighbors. We're just a very small family. We're surrounded by all these people. They're going to gang up on us and kill us. And the brothers say to him, simply, should we let him treat our daughter like a harlot? Now, if you were Yaakov, if you were the father, and your sons had just done this, they go off into Shechem, and they kill all these people, what would you say to them? You wouldn't say to them, oh, you got me in trouble, they're going to gang up on me. And you say, what's wrong with you guys? What kind of Chil Hashem is this? How do moral, ethical people do this? You walk into town and kill a bunch of people who are innocent because two people wronged you? What's wrong with you? Haven't you learned anything? Haven't you learned the lessons of Avram and Yitzchak, your father, your grandfather, and your great-grandfather? What's wrong with you? So Hirsch has an incredible explanation. When they said, when the brothers said to Yaakov, what do you want to let us treat our sister like a harlot? Hey, megalim et kol nimukam. This clarifies their whole perspective. Hadon lo haya marshe li atzmo et kol zeh, el malei hayta zunara yudiya zara v'azuva. This guy would not have done this, except that he found a Jewish girl, a foreigner, who was all alone, and he decided to do this. He wouldn't have done it to any other girl. Rayon zeh orer b'libam. This idea aroused in their hearts at hakara, the realization, sheyesh regaim bahem gam mishpachat Yaakov tochaz b'cherev kedei lahagen al kavod v'tohar. That this aroused in their hearts, in the 19th century, aroused in their hearts the feeling that there are times that even the family of Yaakov, even Jews, have to pick up the sword and defend the honor of their family. As long as the world continues to believe that might makes right, that only powerful people have rights, Yaakov also has to train himself to fight. They weren't trying to be smart. They wanted to frighten and to cast awe on everybody else, that nobody else should ever have the chutzpah to do something like that to a defenseless Jewish girl. They went too far. They shouldn't have killed all these innocent people, but their motivation was clear and pure. We can only condemn how far they went, their tactics, not their motive. Their goals, their motivation, their aims were holy and righteous. This had to be something that a nation, the nation of Yaakov, that for the rest of history was going to be constantly subjected to degradation and difficulties. And despite all of that, stood with their heads held high and created this incredibly noble way of life. They had to do this. They had to make this point. So Od al Eres Moto, when Yaakov is on his deathbed, near meaning we will see at the end of Parshat Vayechi, את האב הישיש מקלל את הדרכים בעברה הקשה. He curses their tactics. He curses how far they had gone. אך מברך את המניעים ואת הרוח. But he blesses the motive. He blesses the idea. He understands that what we're doing. So this is a 19th century German Rav with this sensitivity to the history of Jews for the previous thousands of years, reading that into the actions of Shimon and Levi many thousands of years earlier in Shechem. It's silly, but we only have 10 minutes or so, but Torah Derech Eretz. Torah Derech Eretz is what he's most famous for. Torah Derech Eretz means that it is perfectly appropriate to study secular subjects. It means that God never intended, and Chazal never intended, Jews to cloister themselves, to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, and spend their lives learning Torah and nothing else. So if you look at the next page, from Red Chanan, the Dibarta Bam, and here he has been subjected, Rav Hirsch has been subjected to the most awful revisionism, and often revisionism by people who should be most loyal to the legacy of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, such as the people who run what is called Yeshivat Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, known as Breuers in Washington Heights in New York, and their descendants who have completely revised history. I could take that someone showed me, not surprisingly, the Art Scroll biography of Rav Hirsch, written by a member of that community. And it's hard to believe that anything written by Art Scroll HaKadosh isn't true, but they took quotes right out from what we're going to do, and they just stopped right before the sentence that they didn't like. And they just didn't include those sentences. Or for instance, we talked about Rav Hirsch's problems with the Rambam. I looked in the book. The word Rambam appears once in the entire book in a footnote, and it has nothing to do with what we were talking about. They can't imagine the possibility that Rav Hirsch was somehow critical of the Rambam. It's not even mentioned. But look at this. The Dibarta Bam from Priyat Shema. So the beginning is very clear, and this is very important. He quotes the Medrash, Aseoto ikar v'al tasem tefillah. Make sure that Torah is the most important, not the least important thing. Shelo yeh masacha umatancha ela b'hem. That everything you discuss, everything you do, your whole life should be based on Torah. Shelo tarei b'hem devarim achirim. Don't mix other things into them. Shelo tamar lamati chachmat Yisrael elech v'yomad chachmat haknanim. I learned enough Torah, now I'm going to go learn the chachma of the people around me. Limud Torah yeh ikar yisukenu haruchani. But if you go down to where it's underlined, and this is the sentence that they didn't include, Mamarim eila inam dorshim meitanu hitalem lachalutin mikol hakarot hamadiyot shenirchashu v'tupchu b'chugim achirim. These psukim and these rabbinic statements do not in any way demand of us to completely remove ourselves or ignore all the scientific and cultural ideas that come to us from other circles. In fact, the next sentence I find even more instructive. Elohim manichim shadam baki b'hakarot eila. The Chachamim Chazal just assumed. Of course Jews know what's going on in the world. Of course Jews know what's going on in science. Of course Jews know what's going on in history. How could they not? They're part of the world. And that's why they felt it was necessary to say to us, make sure that the Torah takes precedence over your secular knowledge. But it was just generally assumed, of course Jews know secular knowledge. If you go on to the next paragraph, which is in Achrimot, where it's talking about where we're asked to not imitate the ways of people around us. Don't think that we are asked to hide ourselves, to stay away from any chachma that comes from outside Judaism. That we're supposed to isolate ourselves or cloister ourselves away from anything that doesn't directly address Torah. And if you go to the English, right on the left side, he's saying, Now that emancipation has come, underline, can the Jew not absorb everything in European culture that is noble and good? Or in the next sentence, it would be and you'd bet, it would be most perverse and criminal for us to seek to instill in our children a contempt based on ignorance and truth for everything that is not specifically Jewish, for all other human arts and sciences, and the belief that by inculcating our children with such negative attitudes, we could safeguard them from contacts with the scholarly and scientific endeavors of the rest of mankind. Or going then to Yud Gimel, Israel has always welcomed the Hellenic, as Greek, spirit as a precursor and helpmeet of its own mission to enlighten and civilize mankind. He even goes further in the third, next to the last paragraph, for this we require Jewish schools in which equal attention shall be paid to the old sacred inheritance of the community of Jacob, biblical and rabbinic knowledge, and to all that is true, noble, and good in European culture. And Lamasa, in effect, because the government, and anyone who lives in Quebec knows the government's like to get involved in education, the government in Germany actually made sure that in Rav Hirsch's school in Frankfurt, which is then part of the German kingdom, he had more hours of secular studies than of Torah studies, because the government demanded it. For these reasons, the educational institutions of the Israel, it should be Israelitiship, and Religionsgesellschaft, feels convinced that it ought to pay no less attention, devote no less care to subjects of general education and to specifically Jewish. So what do people who are against this say? What's the obvious response? It was a Horatcha. He was dealing with a specific situation in Germany in the 19th century. But if you read all this, it's very, very clear that he thought that this was what it was originally supposed to be. If you look at the top of the next page, Tet Zion, nor should you lend your ears to those who alienate themselves from life and science, believing that Judaism must fear them as its worst enemies. They are mistaken in believing that Judaism and all that is holy to it can only be saved by shutting off the sanctuary of Israel within its four walls. And the foundation stone of his shul, Kahalash Shul in Frankfurt, had that. May we merit to raise up together our sons and daughters to Torah and Derech Eretz as we were instructed by the founding fathers of our nation, the true sages. So as far as Rav Hirsch was concerned, he wasn't inventing something. He was going back to the tradition that Chazal had instituted, that it is right and proper and normal for Jews to be involved in all aspects of life, all aspects of knowledge, as long as we understand that there is a difference between human knowledge and divine knowledge, and that when somehow that divine knowledge must take precedence, and that we be filtering what we learn from human knowledge through a filter, through the prism of Torah, but that we're not only, and to make sure that we understand that he didn't even want to limit this to Germany. At the very bottom of that page, he wrote a letter to the rabbis of Hungary in 1869. Let no one cast aspersions on the memory of the rabbis of yore, may they rest in peace, or on the living counterparts among our brethren in Eastern Europe. Their suspicions regarding general culture are to be respected. They emanate from genuine concern about all that is holy in Israel. These concerns are easily comprehended in the light of corrupt practices of their opponents. Nevertheless, they are in error. Indeed, there is no hope for the future of the Jewish community until this error is rectified and until the entire Jewish community adapts the feeling of Torah and Derech Eretz. And in this, he went way beyond, for instance, Rav Lichtenstein, would not have accepted this statement. Rav Lichtenstein would have said, there are many, many different approaches to Torah. So there is a Kulo Torah approach. There is what was called the Shemen Zayit Zach, the pure olive oil approach, which is completely unadulterated. And that's purely respectable. And there were Gedolei Yisrael throughout history who adopted that position, and it's an authentic and respectable position. Rav Lichtenstein would have said, but it doesn't work for me. And for me, and for many people in my generation, I need more. I need to be influenced somehow by secular culture. I need to be understanding what other beautiful and noble ideas come to us from outside of the Jewish world. So he would not have said to these rabbis, as Rav Hirsch did, you're wrong. He would have said, I understand you, it's right for you, it's not right for me, it's not right for my community. But Hirsch went that far. Now the rest of it, we're going to have to stop now. He was an incredibly interesting guy in terms of education and in terms of the role of women. He was a pioneer in terms of education. I have a whole bunch of friends who went to Yeshiva Rabbeinu Samson Raphael Hirsch, British Yeshiva, and it's as if, when you read this, when they started that yeshiva in Manhattan, they took all of Rav Hirsch's ideas and said, let's create a school that's exactly the opposite of everything that Rav Hirsch did. He believes very strongly in individualization. He believes very strongly in treasuring and encouraging questions. He believes that children have rights. He believes that you can't educate children unless you understand their streak of independence and why they want to be independent and how to use that. He says that we should be observing children in free play when they're little and getting to get a sense of their personalities and then figuring out how to use their personalities towards a life of Torah, that there are many, many different approaches to Torah, but each child will need his or her own approach. He believed in education for women. He addressed Chorev to the thinking men and thinking women of his generation. He started a girls' high school in Frankfurt at a time when that was almost unheard of, long before Sarah Schneer did that in Krakow in Poland. But he in fact believed that the primary educator at home should be the mother. He believed that women have a unique sense of mission, a unique view of the world, and a form of patience that only women have, and they should be educating. But he also has some kind of medieval ideas about women that are included. So those of you who read Hebrew can go through that. I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. It's going to be an amazing presentation on Rav Hirsch. We think we have three classes left, I think, to conclude this entire 20-week long course. So I invite everybody to come back next week. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We're going to have a Marav now. We're going to have you guys 9 o'clock in the